Hey, is that we? Well, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. Trent, Mr. Kelly, would you open us with a prayer, please?
Dear Heavenly Father, we just ask that you bless this committee. We ask that you bless this government. We ask that you bless all those who lead this great nation. Dear Lord, we just ask that everything we do honor and please you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Thank you, Trent. This meeting, Committee of Agriculture, regarding development of the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans will come to order. And I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. It is no small feat to get two of the secretaries of two of the most important agencies in government to come sit at the same table at the same time. And so I thank you, Secretary Vilsack, Secretary Burwell, for making this happen. We certainly appreciate it. We're joined today by the Secretary of Agriculture and the Secretary of Health and Human Services to discuss the development of an important document, the 2015 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. It's not this committee's intention to legislate specific recommendations or guidelines. However, we will demand that the guidelines be developed in a transparent and objective manner. The DGA is not only a recommendation to the American people on how to make healthy food purchasing decisions to live a healthy lifestyle, but it also forms a basis of federal nutrition policy, education, outreach efforts used by consumers, industry, nutrition educators, and professional healthcare professionals. It's essential that the guidance that comes out of this process can be trusted by the American people. To achieve this, it must be based on sound, consistent, and irrefutable science. The DGA is congressionally mandated under the National Nutrition Monitoring and Related Research Act of 1990. According to that, nutritional and dietary information and guidelines for the general public shall be based on the preponderance of the scientific and medical knowledge current at the time the report is prepared, and shall be promoted by each federal agency in carrying out any federal food, nutrition, or health program. Ensuring a sound development process is important because it is extremely difficult to reverse or change public policy once implemented without causing consumer confusion. At a time when consumers are already subjected to conflicting and often contradictory nutrition and health information, staying within the scope of the intent of the law by providing the public with science-based, realistic, and achievable information is more likely to contribute to improve public health outcomes. The process of the 2015 GGA began in 2012 when Secretary Vilsack and Secretary Burwell's predecessor, Secretary Sebelius, created and then appointed the 15 members to the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee. Through this committee though this committee is not specifically authorized, all advisory committees must be chartered under the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which requires that the advice rendered by the committee be objective and accessible to the public by formalizing the process for establishing, operating, overseeing, and terminating the committees. This makes the committee solely responsible to the USDA and the HHS, who are then responsible for continually reviewing the committee's performance and process compliance, which included activities as detailed as approving all of the meeting agendas. It is therefore the responsibility of USDA and HHS to maintain control over the scope and methods used by DGAC. I personally weighed in with both of you, as have many of my colleagues, about our concerns with the process of developing the guidelines. I raised concerns about the committee's report shortly after its release and called on you to extend the public comment period, which you did, and I appreciate that very much. USDA and HHS received over 29,000 public comments, many of which were developed by nutritionists and other experts in the study of human health. Included in their submitted comments, available for public viewing on DGA's website, were scientific studies and other evidence that observers assert had been ignored by the committee. As a result, I repeatedly requested that each and every comment be considered by USDA and HHS before the final guidelines are published. In May, the ranking member and I sought in writing details on your plan to review the more than 29,000 comments and to make sure that they review properly. Your response to us on that plan, though, was less than sufficient, so I look forward to today on this matter. Uncertainty in the process leads to concern about whether the committee's recommendations will maintain the scientific integrity necessary to be actionable by Americans. It's my hope that the USDA and HHS review of the 2015 recommendations, that they're mindful, that in that review they're mindful of the process failures that lie squarely between each of the recommendations. It's imperative to hear assurances from each of you that Americans will ultimately be presented with the best and most reliable information for making healthy food and beverage choices. Again, thank you, Secretary Vilsack, Secretary Burwell, for being with us today, and I look forward to our conversation. Comments from the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I welcome both Secretary Burwell and Secretary Vilsack to the committee and look forward to your testimony. Given that USDA and HHS are still reviewing comments, we're probably getting ahead of ourselves here, but I do hope that today's testimony can shed more light on the process to establish new guidelines and what they will actually mean for our constituents. There's been a strong reaction to the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report. I've heard concerns about future sodium targets, difficulties of meeting the guidelines, and what this could mean for cranberries and sugar. But these are mostly coming from those who are directly impacted, industry, schools, medical community. We're not really hearing from the public, and I don't think the general public is paying much attention. For those who are, I think they are very skeptical of the whole process. For example, we were once told that butter and eggs were bad for you. Now I guess they're okay. According to the Washington Post this morning, they were wrong on milk as well. And I don't know how much government subsidized powder we bought because of it. So people, I think, may be losing confidence in these guidelines. Given the public skepticism, maybe we should reconsider why we're doing this. Is it because it's something that we've always done? Or maybe we should first look to expand on a provision in the 2008 Farm Bill that would help us understand more about what people are actually eating and then go from there. I am a little concerned that we've lost sight of what we're doing, and there seems to be more focus on ideology and marketing food products than providing nutrition advice to the general public. But I do hope we can have a productive hearing, achieve a good outcome. I know you're going to do the best that you can breaking through all this noise, and I thank the secretaries for appearing before us today, and I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. I'd like to inform my colleagues that Ms. Burwell has a hard stop at 11:30. She's got an international flight to catch. And so with that, I don't know which wants to go first. Ms.
I'm
Burwell?
happy to. Yes.
5 minutes.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Peterson, as well as members of the committee for the opportunity to discuss the dietary guidelines. I want to begin by thanking the committee for your interest in the dietary guidelines and for your work to support Americans and a healthy agriculture sector. One of the most important responsibilities that our government is entrusted with is protecting the American public, and that includes empowering them with the tools they need to make educated health decisions. Since 1980, families across the nation have looked to the Department of Health and Human Services and Agriculture for science-based dietary guidelines to serve as a framework for nutritious eating and healthy lives. Lay a foundation for preventing diet-related health conditions like obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. As is required by the National Nutrition Monitoring and Related Research Act, the departments update these regulations and guidelines every 5 years. The key elements that make up a healthy lifestyle remain consistent: fruits and vegetables, grains and lean proteins, and limited amounts of saturated fats, added sugars, and sodium. We anticipate these will continue to be the building blocks of the 2015 guidelines, updated to reflect the latest research and science, as well as our current understanding of the connections between food and health. As part of our effort to rely on the best science available, we have appointed an independent advisory committee of nutrition and medical experts and practitioners to inform each edition. The 2015 Advisory Committee evaluated research and considered comments from the public to develop recommendations included in its finished report. It is important to note that the Advisory Committee report is one input into the dietary guidelines. The guidelines themselves are written and reviewed at both of our departments. In addition to the recommendations of the Advisory Committee, our department's experts perform their own extensive review and consideration of public comments. In fact, as was mentioned, we received 29,000 written comments during the 75-day public comment period. As a result, the 2015 dietary guidelines will be informed by a review of thousands of scientific papers and decades of nutrition and medical research, as well as input from the public. We know that the guidelines are of critical importance to many Americans. They contribute to a culture of wellness and empower individuals to better manage their own health, help keep their families healthy, reduce the onset of disease, and reduce the amount of money that we spend on health care. They also provide guidance to public and private programs and support efforts to help our nation reach its highest standard of health. At HHS, the Dietary Guidelines provide a roadmap for the nutrition, advice, and services that we deliver, such as chronic disease prevention efforts, food assistance programs, and educational initiatives. HHS and USDA are working together to finalize 2015 Dietary Guidelines, which are expected to be completed in December of this year. Without a finished product, I'm unable to comment on the final content of the forthcoming edition at this time. I expect, however, that the new guidelines will continue to emphasize the importance of healthy eating habits and individual food choices. I want to thank you again for your interest in this topic, as well as the feedback that we have received. I know many of you have specific questions and concerns, and I want to assure you that we are taking your concerns into consideration. And we're working hard to answer your questions as thoroughly as we can as we are in the process of doing the guidelines. I look forward to continuing to work together and look forward to your questions today. Thank you.
Thanks, Secretary. Secretary Vilsack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Ranking Member Peterson and all of the members of this committee. I want to thank the Chair for the opportunity to be here today, and I want to thank my colleague Sylvia Burwell for the extraordinary work that she and her team have done in concert with the Department of Agriculture in getting us to this point today. I will tell you that I struggle with the dietary guidelines because I think it's important to understand precisely what they are and what they are not. These guidelines are a set of recommendations based on a series of well-informed opinions that create a framework that is designed to encourage and to educate Americans about what they can do to increase their chances of preventing chronic diseases. This is not about treating disease. This is about trying to prevent chronic diseases. As a result, the guidelines that we formulate are and should be restricted by law to nutritional and dietary information. The advisory committee report Secretary Burwell mentioned is not the guidelines, and sometimes there's confusion about that. The report informs our work, but certainly does not and should not dictate it. Only HHS and USDA can and should write the guidelines based on a variety of inputs. This has been an open and transparent process. Questions were posed by and to the advisory committee. A number of studies, indeed thousands of studies and tens of thousands of pages of documents were reviewed. Those reviews went through a very strict and gold standard process for determining what is the strongest, best, and most available science. Multiple public meetings took place. Information was posted on the web. And we indeed received 29,000 comments as a result of the extended comment period, of which 8,000 comments are probably considered unique. Recognize that our process here is to determine the best available science, and based on that and the preponderance of that, we formulate the guidelines. I believe I have the same goal that Secretary, finish our work on time before the end of the year so that we can use these guidelines as directed by Congress. So I too look forward to your comments and questions, and I think this hearing is an important opportunity for us to educate folks about what these guidelines are and what they are not.
Well, thank you. I got ahead of myself. Let me mention that Chair requested other members submit their opening statements for the record, and I have rudely failed to introduce Secretary Tom Vilsack, who's the Secretary of the Department of Agriculture, and the Honorable Sylvia Burwell, who's Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. Two folks who didn't know introduction, and I didn't introduce you, so but I apologize for that. Chair would remind members that they will be recognized for questioning in order of seniority for the members who were here at the start of the hearing. After that, members will be recognized in order of arrival, and I appreciate the members' understanding, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Burwell, you said in your comments that the guidelines don't change substantially from one set to the next, but yet the reports have gone from 57 pages of the 99, the committee reports, commission reports, 99 or 57 pages and 95 to 571 pages. I'm not sure we've gotten 10 times better information today than we did in that point in time. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the oversight we're conducting today is on the development of the guidelines, and it's out of concern for the integrity of the process and its resulting recommendations. The Federal Advisory Committee Act defines how advisory committees operate. The law puts special emphasis on open meetings, chartering, public involvement, reporting. According to statute, the Federal Advisory Committee shall, among other things, require the membership of the advisory committee to be fairly balanced in terms of the points of view represented and the functions to be performed, contain appropriate provisions to assure that the advice and recommendations of the advisory committee will not be inappropriately influenced by the appointing authority or by special interest, but will instead be the result of advisory committee's independent judgment. Despite these statutory safeguards, serious questions have been raised about the overall oversight of the overall DGAC process while it was ongoing. This tended to fuel concerns that members of the Commission may have been appointed in order to achieve certain policy outcomes outside the legitimate purview of the Advisory Committee. I refer specifically to an op-ed published on October 1st, 2015 by former Deputy Secretary Kathleen Mitchell as Executive Director of the Sustainability Institute at George Washington University. I note that Secretary Merrigan was serving as USDA Deputy Secretary during the time that DGAC was chartered and appointed. The suggestion of including sustainability and tax issues by the DGAC has been a topic of intense discussion for some time. I recognize that you both jointly published a blog yesterday acknowledging that sustainability is out of the scope of this exercise, and I hope to get some comments from you about tax issues as well. I'd like to I'm likewise sure you recognize that the inclusion of these issues in this process could have resulted in misguided recommendations which would have ill effects on consumer habits and agricultural production. The counter to potential bias in the process is the public comment period. The 75-day period was the public's first real opportunity to review the 571-page document. In your written statement, Secretary Burwell, you mentioned that USDA and HHS staff have already fully reviewed all the comments. You also mentioned that you focus most heavily on those with scientific justification. Help us understand then what's going on right now. What have you done with the studies, such as those evaluating low carbohydrate consumption patterns since the review's been been taking place?
I think there were a number of issues raised, and I apologize, I could not hear your final question.
Well, what have you been doing? We've got the study in. Then you've been studying the comments and the report itself. Can you talk to us about how you've been evaluating other information like low carbohydrate consumption patterns as a part of that review?
So with regard to one issue that you touched on earlier that I want to go ahead and address, I think you asked, which was the tax issue and the question of tax policy. I think like our comments yesterday in the blog that Zach and I put out about the issue of sustainability, I think while we haven't received recommendations from our staff speaking to the specifics of what are in the dietary guidelines, I think that is a question of scope, like the sustainability question, and that is not an issue that we would address. So on the tax issue, want to address that. With regard to the process that we are now going through and how, whether it's the carbohydrate issue or any of the specific issues, what is happening is we receive the guidelines, we receive the report of the committee. Our staffs are reviewing that. At the same time, we are reviewing all of the public comments that we have received. In addition to that, we are bringing in the experts from all of our departments to make sure that they weigh in as we can do the consideration. And for us, that includes the Food and Drug Administration, the NIH, the Center for Disease Control, the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health, and any others. So that's the process that we are using now to review what we received and to put together the guidelines.
The guidelines would be, could have things in them that weren't necessarily directly reported in the recommendations from the commission, from the committee. You could have outside your own wisdom, your own thoughts would be reflected.
In terms of the expert advice of our staffs that exist, with regard to the question of studies and pieces of work, I think it is important to reflect what Secretary Vilsack said, which is there has been a systemic literature review with regard to the studies, and that's part of keeping integrity to the process. With regard to our experts who are constantly involved in those issues, yes, they will be a part of that process.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you both know that sodium not only provides a benefit in making product shelf stable, it also improves taste and is an important food safety component in cheese. Studies have shown that there is an inconsistent and insufficient evidence to conclude that lowering sodium intake below 2,300 milligrams per day decreases risk of cardiovascular disease, and the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee agreed. So why has the committee continued to support further sodium reduction And is this something that you'll be able to address in your guidelines?
Well, let me take a stab at that. First of all, I think it's, again, I think we're going to probably respond to a number of these questions by pointing out these guidelines have not been formulated yet, and we can't comment on the specifics of what the guidelines will be because we haven't had an opportunity to prepare them and to review them. Having said that, in the advisory committee basically is formulated. They go through a process, as Secretary Burwell indicated, of reviewing a variety of studies. There no doubt were studies that linked pre-hypertension, hypertension to sodium consumption. They probably looked at the National Academy of Medicine studies in terms of sodium, and they probably concluded that there was evidence relating to sodium consumption and these chronic diseases, which is why they have recommended what they've recommended. The reality of this situation is that that science changes, and we learn more information. And that's why it's important to have a process that we have in place to review what the advisory committee recommends, then to have public input, to get public comments, to have our own staff review studies based on information that they've accumulated during the course of the 5-year period since the last dietary guidelines, and also to refer back to the last session for this set of guidelines. So, Congressman, I can't comment specifically on why the advisory committee did what they did because they sort of operate independent. We don't inject ourselves into that process, but we do basically take their input into consideration along with many, many other studies, many other opinions to try to formulate the best set of guidelines and framework for the country.
Thank you, Secretary. I don't know if have you both have seen the Washington Post story today, Secretary Vilsack. I guess you.
I've seen it, and I've read the several people were mentioned in there. I've read books by those folks in preparation for this. This is what has caused my concern about what these guidelines are and what they are not.
Well, my concern is, we've had these guidelines that have push people away from eggs and butter and milk and so forth, and then they come back and say, well, we were wrong, And so my question is for both of you, what are we going to do to make sure that doesn't happen in the future? I mean, first of all, I guess, do you agree with this? And second of all, how are we going to keep this from happening? Why are we going off on these tangents, if we have a process that's so heavily vetted?
I would say a couple of things. I think first, the consistency over time for most issues has been there. And it's right to point out that with regard to the issue specifically of dietary cholesterol, there has been a change over time. And I think a couple things to answer your question. First, for the most part, things are consistent over time. Second, we need to make sure we use the most scientific evidence we can. And that does get reflected in what the advisory committee has given us. They no longer will do recommendations based on expert opinion. Instead, they will only do recommendations based on the science, and that is a change that will occur. I think the other thing that is an important thing to reflect is that in some cases, science does change. And in the case of our understanding of blood cholesterol versus dietary cholesterol, there has been an evolution and understanding of the difference of those and what they cause. And I think we want to be prepared to make sure we review in a rigorous way times that happen. So I think there's not one simple answer to the problem that you raise, but a number of pieces of how we can work to get to a place where we have the most consistent science-based advice.
And let me just simply add that Congress has directed us to take a look at the preponderance of that available science, which suggests, it's a term that I'm familiar with in the practice of law, it suggests that there may be studies on both sides of an issue. And it is important and necessary for folks to sort of weigh the studies. And one of the challenges of this is to distinguish between one single quality study that is absolutely solid, a bulk of studies over time that may have a slightly different view. And this is the challenge here. And it's a reflection of the fact that all of this is evolving. You're not going to ever have something that just basically is going to be a fact about this because science evolves. We learn more, we understand more, and I would hope that we would be flexible enough to appreciate that and to take that into consideration.
Well, I thank both of you for your observations, and I think you've made some points, but I just want you to understand from my constituents, most of them don't believe this stuff anymore. You have lost your credibility with a lot of people, and they are just flat out ignoring this stuff. And so that's why I say I wonder why we're doing this, from what I'm hearing from my constituents. So what it's
Congressman,
worth.
can I respond to that for just a second? Here's the challenge, though. We take these guidelines, we incorporate them in our website, Choose My Plate. We've had over 290 million hits on Choose My Plate. So it may very well be that there are folks who are concerned about this, but I still think there's merit in it as long as people understand what they are and what they're not. They are not hard. They are a guideline, a set of guidelines, a framework, and they're not about treating disease. They're about preventing it.
Thank you. Mr. Doggerbauer, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to something that the chairman was asking, and I want to make sure that we are all on the same page here. So taxes are off the table as far as consideration in the guidelines. Is that correct?
With regard to the question of whether there be a tax recommendation in our dietary guidelines, we do not believe that that is something that is in scope of the work.
Vilsack?
Well, that's not within the scope. It's not dietary, it's not nutrition, and it doesn't belong in this context. There's probably many other ways in which that conversation should be taken and should be had, as is the case with sustainability. It doesn't belong here, it belongs elsewhere, and I'm happy to have that conversation with folks if they're interested.
So sustainability, and both of you agree then, sustainability and taxes are off the table as far as these recommendations are concerned.
Both important issues that we believe should have conversations, but not in the context of this document.
Thank you. HHS and USDA have always stated that they have looked to appoint members to the DGAC, so it consists of nationally recognized experts in the fields of nutrition and health. As you know, the DGAC is subject to the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which is widely used throughout the federal government. This act is designed to ensure that the advice of various advisory committees formed over the years is objective and accessible to the public. The act was formalized a process of establishing an opening on operating and terminating these advisory bodies. From 2015, the DGA edition, HHS and USDA began to solicit DGAC in 2012. Once selected and appointed, the DGAC was composed of academics, including professors, epidemiologists, and even a physician scientist. In a departure from prior dietary guidelines advisory committees, nutritionists and food scientists were not selected to serve on this DGAC. Understandably, questions regarding the inherent bias are being raised by the fact that no food industry scientists were included in the DGAC committee. Additionally, after the DGAC had officially disbanded, the former advisory committees, the members decided to hold a public event acting in their capacity as DGAC members, which they were not according to the committee's charter and Federal Advisory Committee Act. Based on the charter, is the DGAC's responsibility to review the science and make recommendations to both of your departments, which is then developed for final recommendations for the public. It is, however, not the responsibility of the DGAC to educate the general public on the report that still needed to be considered by the HHS and USDA before claiming the nutritional recommendations dietary guidelines. Secretary Burwell, what instructions were given the advisory committee members regarding the FACA and the advisory committee's disbandment?
With regard to the specifics of the disbandment, I can get back to you, Congressman. With regard to the direction that was given is to review the science with regard to the issues that were in front of them with regard to the dietary guidelines and present a report about that. So with regard to the question of disbandment, I don't know what, if any, specific direction was given, but I think the point that you've made, which is this is about an advisory committee producing a document, an independent group of people producing a document that then is an element in the basis of what our decisions will be on the dietary guidelines, is what their role is.
Well, was their role to then go out and start doing a road show on their recommendation? Is that a part of the scope of that committee?
With regard to what we followed, at least at the department, and what I know about is the fact that once we received the committee's recommendations and the public comment period. That was the part that we have both been focused on, and the 29,000 comments that have come in from the public, as well as when we heard from you all that you asked for an extension of the public comment. Secretary Vilsack and I very quickly agreed that that was something we thought was an important thing to do. That's
Well,
the part of the process in
I think the
terms of
question
public
here
input.
is that one is, did they follow the guidelines, and what steps were taken to make sure that the committee followed the law? And then from an ethical standpoint is, once you've served as your capacity of that advisory committee and made your recommendations, your responsibility and moving forward. And one of the things we don't want is that these advisory committee turn this into some kind of a profitable situation on their behalf because of their participation on that advisory committee.
With regard to, these are voluntary, non-paid. They all have to file financial disclosures on an annual basis as they go through this process. And so those are all things we want to protect against. With regard to the specific question of a press briefing or some kind of briefing, I apologize, not familiar with that. As I said, we have focused on the public comments and the steps and process that we are following.
Gentleman's time's expired. Mr. Scott for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm very concerned that you're not using the most relevant, basic, and the best science-related information in formulating these guidelines. You certainly did not use some of the most recent peer-reviewed and published nutrition and diet-related science. It was not even considered by the advisory committee, and not even included in the evidence-based library to be considered by the advisory committee when they were finalizing the report. That's a fact. And Mr. Vilsack, you said you were using the best information. Your quote was that we have the best informed opinions. But if you're not using the most recent peer review, that information that is there, and your committee has not even been agreed to put it into the final report, So maybe you all can give me some level of confidence that your staffs and you will take into consideration the strong scientific evidence with the final policy document, even though it was not included in the evidence-based library throughout the working group process.
Congressman, can you be specific about which study you're talking about?
I'm talking about the scientific study that came out that gave evidence that certain things were very important. Let me just give you one example. Let's look at the whole issue of the involvement of sugar and how it's not even included. Why, for example, that low-calorie sweeteners recommended when the study pointed out that low-calorie sweeteners could be used to lower weight, to be able to help with what is called adiposity, and it's not even being used. What's wrong with low-calorie sweeteners that can be used, and it's not even in the report?
Congressman, let me try to respond to the question as best I can. First of all, when you have a process that is every 5 years, you obviously are going to have, at some point in time, a cutoff of what information you consider, because theoretically, the minute before we publish the guidelines, somebody could publish a study and you would be criticizing us for not taking the latest science into consideration. So there has to be a cutoff time in terms of consideration. Having said that, over 4,000 studies were reviewed, 300 manuscripts were reviewed, and they went through a gold standard process for evaluating the appropriateness and efficiency of those studies. So I think it is unfair to the committee and unfair to the process to suggest that we're not looking at the science. We are. Now, number one. Number two, as far as sugars are concerned, look, here's the problem. Our children, 15 to 17% of what they consume is sugar. And so obviously we're looking for ways in which we can reduce that. And I think what they were recommending and suggesting is that if you're going to have sugared drinks, if you're going to have sugar in your diet, you ought to at least look for the most nutritionally dense foods that you possibly can consume for that sugar, that you don't basically use empty calories to obtain it. And so so you could have something like chocolate milk versus a low-cal drink. You would get more nutrition bang for your sugar buck, if you will, out of that process, and that's what they were suggesting.
But you are familiar with that report. The Added Sugars Working Group said that moderate and generally consistent evidence from studies conducted in adults and children supports replacing sugar-containing sweeteners with low-calorie sweeteners to reduce calorie intake, body weight, and so the issue is simply for both of you to be able to explain why the DGAC, the Dietary Guidelines for America, would then recommend that consumers not. That's the whole point. You've used this evidence, it's pointed to it where it could be helpful, but then the committee recommends that the consumers not use low-calorie sweeteners as a tool in the toolbox to reduce added sugars. All I'm simply saying is that if this report is going to have value for the welfare of the American people, and you all say you're using the most relevant basic information, then this clearly contradicts that.
So I think with regard to, there are two different things. One is what the advisory committee has in its report, and the other is what we do in the guidelines. And the specifics of that, as we've said, are not something we received recommendations. My understanding of what is in the committee report with regard to the question of substitution of the drinks is that not enough evidence exists one way or another to make a recommendation. And the committee left the issue of the specific of the substitution.
How much time has expired? Mike Rogers, Alabama, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank y'all for being here. You've both made reference to the fact that you take these comment periods seriously and that you consider these comments in your guideline making process. One particular, and I take you at your word. One particular area of concern to me, though, and producers in my district, is in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee recommendations regarding red meat. The current DGAC report seemingly recommends that Americans consume less red meat. Will your agencies be reviewing studies submitted during the comment period that address the recommendations for red meat, both pro and con, and can you tell me more about that?
Do you want to take the red meat?
In terms of the issue of red meat, I think it's fairly clear that there's a recognition that lean meat is and should be part of a healthy diet. I think the challenge is to understand Americans, if we look at the obesity epidemic that we're confronting in this country, that some of us are consuming more calories than we should. And so the recommendation is in relationship to the overall consumption of calories. And one way to reduce the overall consumption of calories is obviously to eat less of certain things. And in that category would be red meat, but that's by no means the only thing in that category. So I want to be clear here.
I don't understand. I'm sorry, Mr. Vilsack, but why would you include in that category red meat? I mean, why wouldn't you just say anything that takes you over a caloric level that's unacceptable? Why would there be a category of things not to eat?
Because of the importance of having balance in terms of what you consume, in terms of what a healthy diet consists of. Again, remember what this is. It's a set of guidelines which is designed to give you the best chance of reducing cardiovascular, cancer, and chronic diseases.
But wouldn't red meat be part of a list of things that you should eat as long as you eat lean?
It is. It is. That's what I'm saying.
I'm sorry. I thought you said that you would put it in a list of things not to eat.
No, sir.
Okay.
What I said was, if you're concerned about overconsumption of food generally, then obviously you're going to suggest that people should eat less of something that they are eating a lot of. That's the key.
I agree.
To suggest that we're not going to have a guideline, I think it's fair to say, regardless of the fact that guidelines aren't fixed yet, that lean meat is going to be part of a healthy diet. There's no question about that as far as
the
I'm concerned.
advisory committee's recommendation on this is exactly the same as 2010. So I think the Secretary's comments hold.
Okay.
And I think the Secretary's comments are also reflected. I have Fiesta ware. Those are our day wear. Those are the plates, those colorful plates, and my mother used those. The plates that I have for my mother and the ones I got for my wedding, they're a different size, reflecting the issue that we as a nation, I just think that's a visible thing that people see. My mom's plates, they're littler, the ones I have from her, the ones that I got, and this gets to the issue of the totality that we need to work on at the same time that we think about the nutritional content. So we've got too much, and we got to get the right nutritional content. And I think what everybody wants is an opportunity to be able to have guidelines to do that, and I think that's what the hits are about, and everything's about. Being a mother of a 8- and 6-year-old in your time in the grocery store, having worked for the largest grocer in the country, Walmart, the average time for a working mom or dad is like 20 minutes. And so your ability to get in there, get it done, and try and do it in a way that's healthy for your children, you need ease in decision making. This is step one. It's just the guidelines. How it gets translated into other things are the next steps. And I think that's the Secretary's comment about what this is and what this isn't, and why we want something that is useful for working families who are just trying to get this right for themselves and their children.
Great. Thank you both. I yield back.
Jimmy yields back. Mr. Walz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and I want to thank both of you for being here, for the work you do, and Secretary Burwell, I appreciate that last comment, too, as a father of a young son and someone who, as I often tell my colleagues, I supervised the high school lunchroom for 20 years, so you see that side of things and how those school lunches impact. I think you brought up great points here, and this is an important hearing, and I think articulating what this is and what this isn't is really important, because at the heart of this, there's with so much information out there, and Americans are going to try and find it from their uncle's email to them to Dr. Oz and others. They're looking for the gold standard on what makes a difference in their own lives as they search for this. And I think all we have to do is look at the cost of obesity in the United States, estimated at between $150 and $200 billion per year. This is an important subject. We need to help people find the information. They're busy. There's lots of it. And that's why I think the questions that are coming up from colleagues, the integrity of your suggestions, as many of us saw and still do believe as the gold standard on how this gets done, and valid concerns about the decisions we make here. And full disclosure, I have the 9th largest agricultural district in America. We produce lots of pork, lots of milk, lots of turkeys, and all of those things. When we make those decisions, they have an economic impact. So the concern is valid, it's warranted, but I think we have a responsibility to move headlong into this to help the American public get it. So I think for me, it's more of a statement on this. I think we're concerned on process and hearing that. It's important to hear both of you articulate that, and I think it's important for the American public to know that they can trust these as for them, and they're going to make decisions for their own family based on them. So maybe what I would do is just ask you, when you're hearing on these process, do you feel like the concerns you're hearing from members on the totality of the evidence and things, are you comfortable that those are being included when you make your guidelines? You're hearing about members talking that things that aren't included, specific commodities that aren't in that. Are you comfortable? And maybe Secretary Burwell, start with you.
I think that, yes, that we are including these comments, and whether that's the blog that we issued yesterday, we'd had a number of questions that sustainability issue, or the tax issue that we've tried to address here today, that we are across the board hearing and listening. And I think you can be assured that the questions that you all are asking us are the questions that we will be asking our teams as the recommendations come forward. And whether that's, it was mentioned, cranberries, and the issue of something that's a high nutrient, has high nutrient value, and the question of how that interrelates with added sugar and how we think about those issues. Your questions become our questions as part of this process. And we do believe, I mean, the comments that came in, as the Secretary mentioned, there were a number of repeat, 8,000 were probably singular. There were 19,000 comments on sustainability. 97% of those comments, so we're clear and transparent, were positive, and that we should include sustainability as part of the dietary guidelines. And I say that to make the point that we want to hear, we're going to ask the questions, and then based on what the dietary guidelines are and the scientific evidence, that's how we will go about making the decisions.
Great.
I'd only add that the debate that we're having here and the debate that has taken place outside of this room is interest in where their food comes from, how it's produced, who's producing it, who's benefiting from it. And I think that's a healthy debate for us to have in the right context. I
Yes.
think it's a healthy debate for us to have in the context of developing a farm bill. I think it's a healthy debate for us to have in the context of conservation, in the local and regional food system effort. All of those are avenues and vehicles for having that conversation, and we are having that conversation, and we should have that conversation. This, however, is about dietary and nutrition, and that's what we're going to focus on as we develop these guidelines.
I very much appreciate that point of view. With my last 40 seconds, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, my, again, off topic, but I'm going to use it. Effective sequestration on ARC and PLC. I'm going to ask if my folks are out there, if you could help me.
6.8% reduction
Okay.
across the board, regardless of when they came into the FSA office or when they basically.
So what they're hearing is true. There will be a reduction.
Yes, unless something happens with sequester.
Very good. I yield back. Thank you.
Chairman yields back. Mr. Gibbs for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I got to tell you, hearing the ranking member, Colin Peters, Mr. Congressman Peterson's comments, his initial, I agree with about everything he said. Why are we doing all this if it's really necessary? And I just make the comment that there's a lot of information out there for consumers. You got the Medical Association, the cancer, heart. There's all kinds out there. But I am encouraged to hear you say that the process to make sure that the tax sustainability issues aren't part of this, because they shouldn't be. And I guess my only demand, quote, demand would be that use common sense and say moderation. That I think people out there can know, and there's a lot of information out there, and I think these guidelines should just be common sense things. That if you're if you have a weight problem, you need to lower your calorie intake. So that's just kind of my comments. I wonder, I won't even bother to ask how much all this process costs, but I can just imagine. But Secretary Vilsack, I want to ask you, these guidelines are supposed to be guidelines, and how's that affect on the school lunch program? Because we've seen the school lunch program be turned on its head, and there's been all kinds of reports of certain school districts that want to get out of the program, and is these guidelines part of that effect of determining what's happening in the school lunch program?
Well, the school lunch program is obviously focused on compliance with the Healthy Hunger Free Kids Act, which passed Congress in 2010. And in that, Congress directed us to do a better job in terms of the quality and nutritional value of those meals. More fruits and vegetables, more whole grains, more low-fat dairy and less fat, sugar, and sodium. And we are complying with that. And in fact, 95% of school districts have been certified as following the standards. Surveys of children, surveys of school administrators, surveys of parents, and surveys of the public all indicate strong support for what we're doing. And we're helping school districts that are struggling through a series of programs, Team Up for Success, where we're seeing mentoring schools, struggling schools linked up with succeeding schools, and we're finding good success with that program as well. So the dietary guidelines help to inform, as they do with some of the other nutrition programs, as they do with the Department of Defense in developing what they're going to serve our military. These dietary guidelines help to inform the process.
Okay, because I'm just really concerned what's happening in the school lunch program, because I'm hearing issues out there that kids aren't eating, their food's going to waste. And I guess when I think back of it, there's things when I was a kid that I wouldn't eat that I love to eat today. So there's different behaviors.
I'd say a couple things about that. Number one, there are several studies, the University of Connecticut, Harvard Public Health School, that suggest that food waste is not as significant as it has been reported, and in fact is no greater than it was prior to the new guidelines. Number two, it is a matter of time. There is some research to suggest that if kids are given more time to eat, there's less food waste. And the timing of the meal, in terms of whether it's before or after recess, may also impact that. And then finally, interesting conversation with they did away with food trays at Tufts, and what they have found is that has reduced significantly the amount of food waste, because kids come in with a tray and they feel like they have to fill up the tray as opposed to a plate. And they fill up the plate, they get satisfied, they don't go back for seconds, there's less food waste. So I think there's a lot of opportunity here for us as a nation to reduce food waste, but I don't think it's a reflection or an indication of the new school.
When USDA is working on the school lunch program and stuff, is there much discussion about physical activity? I think that's probably maybe more so than what they're, especially in kids.
Well, we have over 6,000 schools that have now been certified under the U.S. Healthier School Challenge, which is an effort on our part to encourage both calories in and calories out. And we reward and acknowledge school districts that are doing a good job of balancing nutrition and exercise. We also have a interesting relationship with the Dairy Association and the NFL on their Fuel Up to Play 60 program. So there is an emphasis on physical exercise.
Secretary, question, you commented about sustainability and all the comments you had. Some of that gets a little weighted by certain agendas, by certain organizations. We saw this in the water rules, waters of the United States. We saw a lot of comments that came in, and obviously that was orchestrated. And so you got to take that. There's agendas out there, and I think just so you're aware of that there's some of those comments are sometimes subject to after how credible they really are. So I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Ms. Fudge, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you both for being here this morning. On August 24th, the Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion issued a Federal Register notice asking for input as to how to better inform the public about the 2015 Dietary Guidelines. I think that's a great idea because so many Americans really do not understand and are confused about the guidelines and the dietary patterns. So tell me how you are planning your messaging around the guidelines. And if you have any just straightforward suggestions as to how Americans can improve their eating habits.
Well, we take the guidelines and incorporate it into our My Plate. Secretary Burwell referred to it earlier. It's an opportunity for us to visually give people an idea of what a healthy plate looks like. The Choose My Plate website, which I mentioned before, is also part of our effort to try to do outreach. We also have a super tracker program that's basically, if you're struggling with weight, I've got it on my iPhone. It basically gives you daily updates on and suggestions on how you might be able to control your weight, tips on substituting foods and so forth, so that you have a healthier, balanced diet. So there are a series of ways in which we incorporate the information from the guidelines in our educational materials, which we then disseminate through a variety of mechanisms, social media and legacy media.
Thank you. How many American households do you believe are at risk for food insecurity? And how can the 2015 DGA address the critical needs of our most vulnerable populations?
Well, I can tell you our focus has been obviously on children, and there are 15.8 million children who live in food insecure homes. That number's down, which is good news. We obviously still have work. There are a variety of ways in which we can provide help and assistance. Some of the obvious ways are the SNAP program and expansion of summer feeding, weekend feeding programs during the school year. There is an opportunity for us to also work with daycare facilities and child care facilities to ensure that youngsters in those facilities get decent snacks. And we mentioned the school lunch program. Unfortunately, a lot of kids today get half or at least a third, and in some cases half, and in some cases all of the calories they consume in schools. So to the extent that we can do a good job of not only providing school meals, school breakfast, and school lunch, but also after-school snacks through our snack program, these are all a variety of ways in which we can try to provide help. The last thing I would say is that we're also trying to find creative ways for SNAP families to extend their SNAP dollar by giving them tips on how they might be able to use fruits and vegetables effectively in recipes. We're also making access to farmers markets more available. Over 6,200 farmers markets today. That's a dramatic increase in the number. Now have the EPT card that allows SNAP beneficiaries to access farmers markets.
Which, by the way, works very, very effectively. I have it in my district, so I thank you for that. Lastly, tell us to maintain the 5-year cycle for the dietary guidelines so that Americans really do get the benefit of the current science for diet and health.
I think we think that the 5-year review is a very important part of doing many of the things that we're being asked to do, which is make sure that we have the most up-to-date science and make sure that we're listening to the public, because it is a formalized process that we do hear from the public, and there are those opportunities. So I think while it's in statute, and that's why a big part of why we do it, I think we would agree that it is important to have points in time where you do the work and settle and do the analysis and the listening. And so I think we think that updating it on a regular basis on a 5-year cycle is important.
I agree.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Generally yields back. Mr. Scott, 5 minutes. Austin Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here I think as we talk about the reports, the credibility of the report is arguably the most important thing. It doesn't matter how much time and money went into it. If we have a credibility gap, we have a problem. Some questions about the fact that Ms. Mylan was from the private sector now. I've read her resume, 30 years at one of the major institutions, certainly qualified in every way, shape, and form from her academic career to be there. But there are questions about the fact that she's now a member of the private sector chairing the committee. Historically, we have not allowed industry representatives on the panel, and I recognize that she doesn't represent, for example, the cattle industry or the corn industry, because we would believe that there would be the assumption, whether true or not, there would be the assumption that there would be bias in the opinions of people who represented a certain industry on the panel. When I see issues like tax on sodas and other things being recommended, it seems to me that ideology is taking precedent over science, and that creates a tremendous credibility gap. Ask as we go forward, how are we going to? How do we make sure that we don't have that credibility gap in the report? Because the CDC and the others do use this information to send out recommendations to the American public, and if the nutrition evidence library is not being used, how do we guarantee the credibility of the report?
Do you want to speak to the nutrition library?
Yeah,
and I'll
go
speak
ahead.
to this? With regard to, I think the credibility is a very important element of the trust of what we have in front of us. And I think that's why we are having the conversation in the places where we can provide clarity, we do, as well as providing clarity. And that's a little bit of some of our follow-up questions about, there is a scientific approach to what documents are included, how they are included. That is the standard of scientific research. The gold standard is used. I've checked, even with our economists, had them come in and look at it.
Can I ask you a question
clearing-
there? If the standard is scientific research, how do recommendations for tax on sodas get into the report?
I think in the advisory committee's report that there wasn't a recommendation. It was an articulation that some use policy, and so I don't think there were recommendations. They did not make recommendations, but I think with regard to the issue that's been raised, I think when we get to the dietary guidelines, how we take what we are given, that is one input, and use it will be an important part of establishing a process that I think people believe in.
I'm down to a minute, so I'd like to hear what Secretary Vilsack has to say, but I would suggest that when you see those things in the report, and whether it's a jump to conclusion or not, there's a belief then that the people on the committee entered with a bias in some way, shape, or form, and we're searching for the science to back up what they already believe to be true instead of using the best available science. Whether it's true or not, we can debate, but there's a credibility gap from those things working their way into the report.
Congressman, I'd like just simply to again emphasize there is a fundamental difference between the advisory committee's report and the guidelines. And there is confusion out there. I think that the report equals the guidelines. It does not. It is one aspect of information that will be taken into consideration relative to the dietary and nutrition guidelines that we have to put together, number one. Number two, the National Education Library was used, and there is an extensive process that's involved in accumulating information and putting it through a filter, if you will.
Secretary Vilsack, I apologize. I'm down to 30 seconds, but I think it was used for 30%, and there were reports that a tremendous number of things were not taken from that library. I have a quick question. This is a text I got from yesterday and that I know very well, and he's saying that their school can't sell candy bars, which they used to do to help pay for a kid's trip, and that they're being told from our local school system that comes from the federal government, that they can't sell candy bars to raise money. Is
That's not true. Folks can sell outside of school, which is what these candy deals are. Outside of school, there's no prohibition. There are exceptions and waivers that can be granted. Oftentimes, it is not the federal law that is in place. It can be a state law that is that, or it could be.
I don't think we'd have that in Georgia.
Well, that may be the case. Well, then folks are mistaken about that.
Thank you, sir, for clearing that up.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. McGovern, 5 minutes.
Thank you, and Secretary Vilsack and Secretary Burwell, thank you for being with us today, and thank you both for your respective agencies' work on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee's report. I know that this is no simple undertaking, and I appreciate the fact that it takes and requires months and months of scientific analysis and consideration of thousands of stakeholder comments and thoughtful collaboration among committee members and agency staff. And I want to say that I appreciate the process that the advisory committee went through. I think it is a solid process, one that was open and included, as you mentioned, many opportunities for the public to weigh in. And I think it's also important to kind of put all this in perspective here for my colleagues to understand that in this country today, 1 in 3 school-aged children and adolescents is overweight or has obesity. And more than 1 in 3 American adults suffers from cardiovascular disease and diabetes. Clearly, we can do better. And that's when I look at what we're all talking about here today. This is an attempt for us to get it better. And if people aren't interested in the well-being of our citizenry, and all they're interested in is the bottom line, they should be very supportive of what you're talking about here today, because at the end of the day, healthier people mean lower health care costs. So we all benefit here. You mentioned earlier that you referred to the HHS blog yesterday, where the issue of sustainability, issues of sustainability were taken off the table for inclusion in the final guidelines. And I get that's the case, and I respect your decision, but this is an important issue, and I think you both have acknowledged that. Sustainability somehow in this Congress is a dirty word. I don't quite get it, but it's important, and we ought to be talking about sustainability when we're talking about issues of diet and food security. And I do think that it's important that at least we start this conversation about this issue in the context of dietary guidelines. I also appreciate that both your testimonies do a good job of emphasizing the importance of nutrition on disease prevention and putting these recommendations into context. In Congress, we ought to be focusing more on prevention as a way to reduce health care costs and improve overall well-being and economic productivity. We should be highlighting what the science says on good nutrition for our kids and for our families. I have an op-ed here today that was in today's Hill newspaper, penned by the presidents of the American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Medical Association. It's titled, Physician's Perspective, Keep Politics Out of Dietary Guidelines, and I'd like to insert that in the record. You know, in it, they talk about the importance of dietary guidelines and the soundness of science used to inform them. And I think, you know, the issue is raised, well, sometimes science changes. Well, it does. You know, everything changes. We know more today than we knew yesterday. Our research techniques have improved, you know, over the last 10, 20, 30 years. So when we learn the latest science, then we need to make the necessary adjustments. You know, as you know, some of the biggest critics of these guidelines are from industries that produce the least healthy foods and from special interests with questionable credentials. I see there from Texas, who is a former Enron executive who's funding some initiatives to try to raise questions about what you're doing. I don't know what Enron knows about dietary guidelines, but nonetheless, there are powerful special interests out there trying to raise issues of credibility, trying to question science. And so I just will conclude by saying I encourage you to keep, first and foremost, the health and well-being of our kids and our citizenry in the forefront as you move forward. And maybe in my last minute, you can explain to me about, you know, if we all improved our diets, what would be the impact on the rates and costs for diabetes and heart disease and and obesity. Secretary Burwell?
So I think with regard to when I examined both Medicaid and Medicare costs over the 10-year period, and as a trustee, as one goes out over periods of time, both heart disease and something that we know about how to do, and diabetes, are two very, very large cost drivers for us as a nation. And they're cost drivers because those are both conditions that can continue over an extended period of time, and especially as we have a population that lives longer, which is a good thing. But the idea that these are costs that are controllable. And I would also say that in my engagement with the private sector and CEOs of companies, I'm sure you all hear this in your districts, they talk about wellness a lot. And the reason they are so deeply focused on this issue and want to engage with us as a department on the issue is because they are putting initiatives in place because they are starting to see, and I was actually just with NAM this week, the National Association of Manufacturers, and had one of the CEOs who says she's done it now for almost 10 years and she has the analytics to show it. Those are analytics companies can make decisions on. We want to see those to see if they're worthy enough for us to make decision money. So it's across the board in both the public sector spending and the private sector spending on these health issues. And diabetes and heart disease are two of the leading costers that we have, both publicly and privately.
Gentleman's time has expired. I'd ask my colleagues' indulgence. Secretary Burwell has a hard stop at 11:30, and given the apparent interest everyone has in getting this, I'd ask for colleagues' unanimous consent to go to 4 minutes for questioning so that we give a chance for everybody to get here if you to make that happen. So without objection, we'll go to 4 minutes this point forward. So Mr. Crawford for 4 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kind of keeping on that subject, a lot of attention has been paid to the dietary guidelines and the fact that they are guidelines. They're not rules. Am I correct in that?
Yes, they are guidelines
Okay.
that then are used as a basis for programmatic and policy decisions.
Okay, so they actually are used pretty hard and fast on rulemaking then, correct?
It depends on which programs. So, for instance, I think school lunch programs in our area, the Administration for Community Living, meals and those types of programs, they're used and they're applied in different settings in different ways.
We've heard a lot of talk about the school lunch program, and it seems that, I know that my colleague mentioned he had gotten a text just in the last few minutes, and I've gotten phone call after phone call after phone call once the new school lunch program was implemented fully in 2012. But there's been very little attention paid to how we roll this out and apply it rigidly to SNAP program. And so it seems like using the argument that, well, we can be proactive and we sort of help to regulate the kind of food that people eat, that we can control. The Secretary mentioned Department of Defense and meals that our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines receive. We mentioned the school nutrition program, meals that our students receive, but we're not talking about actively engaging in how we do a better job in administering the SNAP program with respect to the sugary drinks that are often purchased and all the other things that are bad according to these guidelines. So why aren't we doing a better job of actually going in and proactively engaging in rules that help us do a better job on dietary structure as it applies to the SNAP program?
Well, first of all, we are trying to address this through a variety of mechanisms. The Farm Bill provided for the Food Nutrition Insecurity Initiative, which is designed to provide assistance and help for SNAP families to purchase more fruits and vegetables and alike. The expansion of access to farmers markets is also giving them that opportunity. We are looking at we had a data-based, research-based program at Holyoke, Massachusetts for 2 years to determine what would actually provide direction for SNAP families in terms of purchase, making nutritious choices. What we found was that incentives work. Also, there is a fairly serious technology challenge in terms of trying to prohibit people from using SNAP for certain products.
Okay, let me stop you right there, Mr. Secretary, because I know that our travel card will deny a purchase. If you try to fill up your car on official business with your travel card and then put a Snickers on there, it'll decline that purchase. So I know the technology exists, that we can do a better job at administering what the SNAP card can be used for.
There are 300,000 different products that are sold in grocery stores across the United
Right.
States.
We ought to identify the
So-
ones that aren't allowed.
Well, here's the problem. You want to do sugary drinks, does that include apple juice, 100% apple juice? Do you want to prevent that?
Well, that's my question. Why are we not addressing that on the nutrition?
Well,
on the
I'm asking, you,
supplemental?
do you want to exclude that? Because
I'm
that's
asking you because we're not marking up a bill here. I'm trying to get feedback from you on why the dietary guidelines are not more rigidly utilized in the SNAP program
they
where
are.
they are in the school nutrition program.
They are used in the SNAP program in terms of providing guidance and direction to SNAP families in terms of how they can extend their SNAP dollar, where they can buy fruits and vegetables, how they might be able to use recipes.
And you
that-
mentioned incentives. What kind of incentives are being used to incentivize people to make those smarter choices?
Well, the Security Initiative is providing resources to a number of groups that are providing cash incentives. So when a person goes to a farmer's market and they buy $5 worth of tomatoes, they actually will be able to buy $10 because of the additional incentive. So they get more bang for their buck. It's also an opportunity for associations involved to provide sales, to provide promotions, to provide recipes. There's a whole series of programs. We'll be happy to provide you a list of all of the grants that have been made under that initiative and what actually is being done. I think it might be helpful to you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yield back.
5 minutes? 4 minutes, excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both to the secretaries for being here. I wanted to expand a little bit on that discussion. I participated, and I mentioned it to my colleagues before in the SNAP Challenge earlier this year, and you know, the biggest piece that struck me, I mean, clearly there was an end in sight, you know, when I went through this challenge, but it was the budgetary, you know, constraints on healthy eating. And Mr. Secretary, you were just talking about, you know, those programs and the success that you're seeing in those, and I hope that we can continue to. And I understand that within the dietary guidelines, both USDA and HHS also plan to release, you know, marketing materials. And Mr. Secretary, you talked about Choose My Plate as an example. You know, showing folks how to live on a low budget and a balanced diet. In the advisory committee report, it's mentioned that the best food patterns of healthy living include the healthy U.S. style pattern, the healthy Mediterranean style pattern, and the healthy vegetarian pattern. Do you know approximately how much it would cost to afford each of these lifestyles per week? And could you expand a little bit on the programs that educate low-income families on healthy purchases like the Food Insecurity Program?
Well, the guidelines help to inform a series of meal patterns, and it goes from the high end to the low end. And the Thrifty Food Plan basically is the plan. I don't know the specific dollar amount. Obviously, it depends on the choices that people make, Congressman. But I think we need to sort of dispel the myth that healthy eating necessarily has to be more expensive. And here's why I think people think that. If you take a portion of broccoli, or in the past, the way we judged the value of that was by looking at 100 calories worth of potato chips and 100 calories worth of broccoli. Well, 100 calories worth of potato chips would be about 3 potato chips. 100 calories worth of broccoli would probably fill half this room. Obviously, that's going to be more expensive. But what we ought to be doing is looking at portion sizes, because people eat more than 3 potato chips, and they don't eat a half a room full of broccoli. When you look at portion sizes, fruits and vegetables become you know, affordable, number one. Number two, if you look at recipes, the use of canned and frozen vegetables and fruits also is an opportunity. There are ways in which we can stretch dollars, and so part of our education initiative is to provide people with the recipes and the information that will allow them to use fruits and vegetables more effectively, to understand that it doesn't necessarily have to be more expensive, and then also the incentive programs that we have where we work with foundations to encourage farmers market purchases by incenting those, the food nutrition incentives that allow grocery stores to offer additional bonus points, if you will, for SNAP families to purchase fruits and vegetables. I mean, there are a wide variety of things. And we're also working with food banks to make sure that the areas of opportunity we have to help struggling families also includes more healthy choices. So there's a wide variety of steps and ways in which we're attempting to make a difference.
I'd love to see more as we can stretch to become, you know, healthier. But I would say it was incredibly tough Mr. Secretary, to my wife and I, $66 on the SNAP challenge to include, healthy portions, managing our portions. I eat peanut butter and jelly every day for at least one meal because we were trying to have a couple salads, for the week.
The SNAP program, as everyone knows, nutrition assistance program, it is not designed and not engineered and not funded to be the be-all and end-all for a family that's struggling.
But for countless Americans, it is.
Well, I understand that, but it's, that's why we work with food banks, that's why we work with foundations, that's why we work with shelters, that's why we work with other avenues, that's why we have a school lunch and school breakfast program that they're expanding, that's why we have after-school efforts, why we have a summer feeding program to try to supplement and to fill.
And I look forward to working with you to carry out the mission of those programs to increase the
Gentleman's time is expired. Mr. Desjardins, 5 minutes, 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here. Secretary Burwell, I can count on one finger the number of times that a sitting secretary has reached out to all the members of a committee prior to the hearing to ask if they had any concerns, and so thank you for that. I appreciate you doing that. I know that's time-consuming, but very thoughtful. Historically, the Dietary Guidelines for America policy documents, which you say will be released in December, have not made suggestions about specific ingredients or commodities, yet that has prevented the advisory committee from taking a look at aggregate consumption by the U.S. population of ingredients such as low-calorie sweetener aspartame. Aspartame is one of the most widely studied food additives in the history of the FDA, and its approval came after more than a decade of review through an affirmative food additive petition. FDA has asserted and reasserted the safety of aspartame, yet DGAC used a dubious process to call into question its safety, citing extremely weak science against a backdrop of decades of research that shows otherwise. And now we're calling for more research in spite of the fact that FDA spent over a decade studying this ingredient's safety and concluded there is no increased risk of cancer from aspartame consumption. During your interagency review of the guidelines, are you consulting with the FDA on recommendations after they spent years reviewing the science?
Yes, FDA is a part of the process at HHS, and with regard to the issue of the safety of aspartame, and there are basically 5 products that FDA has said given contents are fine and safe. And so, yes, FDA is a part of the HHS process.
How did the interagency's review ultimately impact the final recommendations?
The interagency review is an extremely important part of the process. I think both the Secretary and I have. The input of the Advisory Committee is something that we are reviewing, but our own experts across our departments, not just FDA for us, but CDC and NIH as well. The whole department is a part of this process. It comes together, reviews everything together, and that is what forms the recommendations that we will receive from our departments collectively together.
Okay. Additionally, DGAC recommends replacing sugared beverages with water and low-fat milk only. However, for the guidelines to be effective to most Americans, we need to be able to meet them in the middle and offer guidelines that is realistic, not idealistic. In your final recommendations, how do you intend to balance dietary ideals that are realistic and achievable for most Americans?
With regard to that question, getting ahead of where the recommendations are from our staff, wouldn't be able to comment on the specifics, but we do look for a balanced approach and an evidence-based approach with regard to where we have the evidence about issues of, when we say balance, it's also about this issue the Secretary raised of nutritional value. And so when you're trying to have a set number of calories and you have to get in certain numbers of nutrition, how you can get that puzzle to fit together is an important part of what we'll think about as we put together the final guidelines.
Okay. Thank you, Secretary. Secretary Vilsack, at the December meeting before the final advisory committee recommendations were voted upon, the committee got in a discussion about the definitions of red versus lean versus processed meat. At the end of the discussion, they decided to remove lean meat from the healthy dietary pattern, even though the scientific data in their own report was not changed and the same as the 2010 Dietary Guidelines, which recognized lean meat as a nutrient-dense food, and nutrient-dense foods were encouraged to increase. It is important for the Dietary Guidelines to have a strong scientific background, peer-reviewed and published research to give Americans clear advice on their diets and health. Can you please give me the assurances that you have both taken into account to ensure strong scientific evidence is the foundation for the 2015 guidelines?
I can, and I can also suggest, it's my understanding, and maybe I'm wrong about this, that the report basically is fairly consistent with the recommendation that was made in the 2010 guidelines with reference to lean meat. I would be surprised if our final conclusion is not to include that as part of a healthy diet.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Costa, 5 minutes.
Yeah, 4 minutes, I got it. Thank both secretaries for your efforts in reaching out. I do appreciate that, and I think to the degree that we collaborate on a greater basis, we all do a better job. A lot of discussion this morning has been talked about the process in these guidelines, and I do appreciate your emphasizing that they are guidelines as a part of a total work product. And I guess I'd like to get your take, both of you, on how we measure success. Clearly, we all believe, I think, or I hope it's not in debate, that part of healthy Americans is is a healthy diet of health care, as our mothers told us a long time ago, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So how do we measure success in terms of the incredible changes that have been taking place in America's dietary habits over decades, and this effort to use these guidelines as a means to provide better diets so that we have healthier lifestyles? Have you thought about that in this process? We're asking you the questions. How can we make this process better?
So with regard to when we think about success, first, the guidelines themselves being a quality product. We need to start with that, and that's a lot of the conversation that we're having today about an evidence-based and quality product. I think the second thing is how the guidelines get used in an appropriate fashion in terms of people understanding what they are.
Do you think we're making progress along those lines? There's a lot of advertising out there that tries to, especially among young people, skew their eating habits.
Yes, and so I think that comes to the third, which is the knowledge has to be activated so that people are acting and behaving. And I think they believe that we as a nation can improve. And we can improve it both at a population health level, and then we improve it in the ways that we use it in the programs, and whether that's the programs at USDA or the programs at HHS in terms of applying them. And CDC and its work in population health is another place that I believe we can make progress.
Secretary Vilsack, you've been at this for 7 years. How do you measure success?
I would only add to what Secretary Burwell said is that, one way potentially of looking at this is to take a look at the Healthy Eating Index that we have, which is a 100-point system. And currently today, the average American is about 57. We've seen improvement over the last couple of years. That's good, but obviously, I don't know what your mother said about 57 out of 100, but my mother wasn't satisfied with that.
No.
So it's important for us, I think, to continue. That's one index, that's one way of measuring. Another way is to measure whether or not we're making headway on obesity. I'm pleased by the fact that at least among young children, we're beginning to see some indication of a plateauing and potentially maybe even a slight decline in obesity rates. That's good news, but we still have work to do. And in terms of improving the process, I would just say the debate is healthy because it allows people to understand what these recommendations are and what they aren't. And I think it is also, there's I think a misunderstanding between a prevention orientation, which is what these guidelines are, versus a treatment orientation, which is a lot of the criticisms often are because you aren't dealing with certain diets that would be helpful in dealing with obesity. And so maybe there's a way in which we could potentially expand or create an avenue for that kind of treatment discussion to take place.
Okay, I have other questions regarding GMO labeling and biotech traits as it relates to that, and I'll submit that for the record because there's not time. I guess just a final comment, and I guess it's, again, getting back to good habits. When I grew up, it was a few years ago, but an 8-ounce was considered a regular thing, and a 12-ounce was really considered big. And then I remember, we were all floored by 16 ounces. Today, to see these 24, it is, I think, a large part of our just sizes and amounts as it relates to obesity and how we combat against obesity. That's a comment.
Gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Hartzler, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretaries. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. As a former family consumer sciences teacher who taught nutrition for years, it's very, very important. And very important to be science-based. So I'm very encouraged to hear that you're going to make sure that it is that. Does it include sustainability, tax policies, other issues? I wanted to focus on the Nutrition Evidence Library. We've heard much about it with even the USDA officials, describing it as a gold standard, but I have heard concerns that the Nutrition Evidence Library has ignored a large, credible, and growing body of peer-reviewed science on low-carb diets as it contradicts the evidence from previous guidelines. So can you elaborate on how scientific studies through the Nutrition Evidence Library and what can be done to ensure that cutting-edge research in nutrition science is considered?
Well, there are four approaches as it relates to the library. There are original systematic reviews. There are existing reports. There are new reports that are funneled in from a variety of different locations. There are a review of what the typical diet of an American might be. Food pattern modeling is also included. So there's a broad array of things that are included in this effort. The issue of low-carb diets raises the point that I just made with Representative Costa. I think that is ultimately in the context of how do you treat a particular condition, obesity, for example. It may very well be that a low-carb diet or a high-protein diet might be a way in which a physician would prescribe for an obese individual to deal with obesity. That's not what these guidelines are about. These guidelines are about preventing that circumstance to begin with. There isn't an avenue within the guidelines today for that treatment discussion, and that's, I think, why there's a lot of confusion about all of this and why there's a lot of angst about it, because some people are looking at the guidelines as treating, and we're looking at what the law requires us to do, and that is focus on dietary and nutritional guidelines relative to prevention.
Now, I have visited with some people that point out that 52% of U.S. adults are pre-diabetic, and they allege that a low-carb diet helps prevent people becoming pre-diabetic, so it is actually, would be helpful to include that.
So in that circumstance, you've got competing studies, which is why it's important to understand that this is really about well-informed opinion. I wish there were scientific facts, but the reality is stuff changes, right? Stuff changes. And the key here is taking a look at the preponderance, the greater weight of the evidence, and trying to make a judgment based on the greater weight of the evidence. If you've got one study on one side and you've got 15 studies on another side, the preponderance of the evidence may be on this side with the 15 studies. And that's a challenge. And that's why we do this every 5 years, to give an opportunity for that quality study to be further enhanced so that 5 years from now, maybe there are 15 studies on this side and 15 studies on this side. It's an evolving process.
In the guidelines, are there any disclaimers mentioned in there that say this may not be true, or for certain populations this might be helpful? Do you include that, or do you just pick one and say this is it?
It isn't so much that. It's a caveat that these are recommendations focused on prevention. They are guidelines. They are not, you shall do this. There are recommendations and suggestions that you should do this. And I think that sort of in an indirect way, I'm not certain. We obviously haven't crafted the guidelines yet, so I don't know whether or not there'll be caveats as you suggest.
Yeah, is there any population? I mean, there's got to be differences perhaps for different populations.
Well, there are.
So the guidelines may not be one size fits all, or do you present it as everybody? This is for everyone.
It's a general guideline. It's a general set of recommendations. I mean, in theory, you could have 317 million different guidelines because we're all slightly different and in slightly different circumstances. So you have to create kind of a wide berth here, but within that wide berth, this is what we're recommending. If you're interested in a healthy diet, if you're interested in reducing the risk of diabetes and cardiovascular, this is a course that you might want to consider. Obviously, people are going to make choices, and that's for them.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Ms. Plaskett for 4 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to you both. Thank you so much for your time today. I was just looking at the volume of comments that you'd received, the 29,000 comments after the report came out. Can you explain how you're going to, and will you be able to meet the time frame that you have for an evaluation of all of those responses to be able to issue that report, the guidelines?
Yes, our staffs have gone through all of the comments. One of the things that is helpful in a sense is that a large percentage of them actually were form letters. So as the Secretary reflected, only about 8,000 were individual, not only, but that's less than 29,000 in terms of our ability to get through. And the Secretary and I are both working very hard with our teams to meet the deadline of this year.
Okay, great. And I guess my other question is related to moderate alcohol intake. And looking at the guidelines that were issued in 2010, and wondering if that at all, I noted in the 2015 committee statement that it confirmed the conclusions from 2010. Do we think that that's going to remain the same, or what is considered moderation, will that change as well?
So as I think you appropriately reflect, the advisory committee has the identical recommendations from the 2010 report. While we're not going to comment on specifics, I think it's important to reflect that there was no change.
Okay.
After this hearing, I may be consulting that guideline.
The FDA would say he meets age requirements.
And I think that's 2 for male.
Good enough.
Well, I just want to thank you all for the tremendous work that you've done. This is, I think, really important to the American people. I'm just echoing my colleagues' discussions about proportion sizes and the need for healthy diets, particularly in communities in which there may be a dearth of fresh foods that are available to them as well. And also, let's not forget, in terms of our obesity, the thing we haven't talked about, which is not just your diet, but your exercise as well, which I think is something that Americans have been woefully lacking in for our young people for some time now. I yield the balance of my time.
Generally, goes back, and I don't think the Secretary was saying you're going to stay till after 5 o'clock, did you? Mr. Rouser, 4 minutes.
It will be 5 o'clock somewhere.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Secretary Vilsack, Secretary Burwell. Thank you both for being here today. I appreciate it very much, because this is an incredibly important issue. And I'm looking at this from a very macro perspective. We've got close to a $20 trillion debt. Medicare and Medicaid, which you referenced a little earlier, is such a huge component of that debt, because a vast majority of our budget is mandatory spending. Medicare and Medicaid are a huge component of mandatory spending. And so you consider the obesity issue that we're facing, and you mentioned obesity and heart disease as 2 major components that drive the cost of Medicare and Medicaid. All that gets back to what we consume. And I think back to my time when I was in K through 12 and versus the schools that I go in today. When I look at the student population, I do not recall, at least when I was growing up, the number of overweight kids that are in school that you have today. And I visit all kinds of schools all across my district. And I'd say a third of them are clearly overweight, and some of them are really young. I mean, exceptionally young. And some of them, I know their parents, I knew their grandparents, and obesity was not an issue in the family until this generation. And so that leads me to think, clearly something has changed in our society over the last 20 in particular. And I look at it from the perspective of, you've got different movements out there influencing public policy. In the Dietary Guideline Advisory Committee, there's the statement in there that says common characteristics of dietary patterns associated with positive health outcomes include lower consumption of red meats. It was mentioned earlier about caloric diet, trying to maintain a certain number of calories. Well, not all calories are the same. I would suggest, just from a common sense perspective, 2,000 calories of beef versus 2,000 calories of donuts are very different. Your body reacts to it very different. Your body takes the carbohydrate and turns it into sugar, and that often goes straight to the belly. Whereas consumption of protein, same calorie amount, the body treats it very differently. In fact, I think if you go and have a blood test done, they measure protein level in your blood, which suggests that obviously protein is a key component to a healthy lifestyle. So my main point that I want to drive home this morning is I think it's very, very important to understand that there's a difference in terms, not all calories are the same. And from a public policy standpoint, I think perhaps maybe we've gotten too smart for our own good. I recognize science has improved dramatically, but mankind has survived for many 1,000 a year on red meat, whole milk. In fact, I remember growing up when there was a report that came out for you, and then they came out and said, actually, no, we're wrong. Eggs, bacon, I remember growing up where they said, you know, may contribute to high cholesterol and heart disease. So I want to make sure that we get back to common sense and that we do what's right, you know, for future generations, because not only for the health standpoint, but that translates directly in terms of the public policy decisions we have to make as it relates to our budget. Finishing it up here, I want to ask both of you.
No, you can't ask anything at this point. We're going to have to keep going.
No problem.
Del Benny, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you both for being here and for your time today. First, I want to ask you about dairy. As you know, it has been a distinct food group in the past, and according to the report, dairy products contribute many essential nutrients: vitamin D, calcium, magnesium, iron, vitamin A, riboflavin. And yet, since 2010, 1% flavored milks haven't been allowed in schools. And we also know that dairy consumption has dropped in girls ages 4 to 8. And so I just had a couple questions of how do we continue to make sure students have access to appealing and nutritious dairy products? And do you expect that dairy would remain its own food group going forward?
Well, I don't want to assume what we're going to do in terms of the guidance, but I will tell you that one of the things that we've done is to work yogurt into the school lunch program, and we're also taking a look at the issue of milk relative to school meals. So that's in the process, not in the context of the guidelines, but in the context of our efforts to try to encourage healthier choices in schools. I don't think there's any question that dairy is an important component. It's going to be recognized and should be recognized.
And kind of on a different note, given that we have regional, cultural, socioeconomic diversity throughout the country, how will the dietary guidelines kind of meet the challenges of being relevant, accessible, achievable for all Americans, knowing that, you know, folks have different backgrounds, cultural backgrounds that may impact the types of foods that they're eating?
I think that many of the programs that the Secretary has spoken about in terms of how you put those out, I think it's about having information that's simple enough that you can use it in your own cultural context, and then it is about a number of the programs in terms of how the information moves, not just the guidelines themselves, but then the programmatic piece that follows on. So I think it's the step beyond the guidelines. Having guidelines that are clear and simple enough that can be applied across context is the first step, but then it's how those guidelines are then implemented.
Right, and we're working at USDA, Native American populations, for example, of where we're trying to work to reflect the traditions and culture of Native Americans and Indians to make sure that their dietary choices are wide enough and wide enough range that they can meet their cultural and traditional needs. So there is, I think, a greater sensitivity, and I think that's the challenge for us in the future, which is to understand those differences and to try to figure out creative ways from recipes and from direction and instruction to reflect those differences without necessarily getting to a circumstance where we have to move away from the purpose of these guidelines, which is a sort of a general recommendation.
Thanks. I guess also then important to understand what the messaging might be going forward and how different folks will understand and be able to learn about the guidelines as well.
Well, there'll be an extensive effort at both departments, but certainly at USDA we'll be using all of the tools that we currently have, which have been pretty effective. The My Plate has been one of the more effective efforts on the part of USDA. We're going to refresh that, obviously, the Choose My Plate, the Super Tracker, the SNAP education and nutrition information that we provide to SNAP families, the work that we'll continue to do on menus with school lunch personnel. There's a variety of ways in which we can incorporate folks in trying to follow these recommendations.
Thank you both again for being here, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back time. I need to apologize, Mr. Rouser. I was brusque and rude. I should have simply said your time has expired. So, David, please accept my apologies.
No problem, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Kelly, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans have been published every 5 years since 1980. We're concerned that the public at large has lost faith in the process to develop the Dietary Guidelines, which will ultimately declare adherence to them with potentially costly effects on public health. in the military, in my service, we often say you can have a SOP, standard operating procedures, but if your units and your soldiers don't know them and use them, you don't have an SOP. It's the same thing with guidelines. Before coming to Congress, I was a prosecutor. And I understand that two people can look at a problem and come to a different solution. And Secretary Vilsack, during your process, you talked about many times the preponderance of an evidence. But as a prosecutor, I didn't get by with that standard because the things that I was doing were so important that I had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt my because for different things and different priorities, the importance of them, sometimes we have to use a different standard of evidence. And I would say maybe a preponderance of the evidence for scientific evidence is not the right standard. Maybe it's clear and convincing evidence. Or maybe it's beyond a reasonable doubt that when we have science, that we hold them to a standard that makes sure that the end result is something that we have a good belief that it will be viable and it will be the right answer. Although we won't always be correct, if we raise the standard, maybe we'll be correct more often.
Congressman?
Further, if I can finish, please. There have always been disagreements about this, and there always will be about what the scientific is. I just say sometimes we may want to look at the standards, but over 1,350% increase in public comments, it raises some concern with me that people don't have faith in the system. So to both of you, I just ask you, what can we do? Because it doesn't matter how good the standards are, and it does not matter if we're doing the right things. If the public doesn't have trust that it's the right thing, we have to build that trust. And Secretary Vilsack or Secretary Burwell, what would you do to make sure that our public, to the guidelines that we're putting forward, are the true and correct ones? Thank you.
Congressman, first of all, the preponderance of the evidence standard is a congressional mandate. So we have to follow the congressional mandate. So if you all believe that it should be a higher standard, that's obviously your call, and whatever your call is, we'll follow it. Secondly, I'm not sure, despite the fact that we had 29,000 comments, we've also had 290 million hits on our Choose My Plate website, which would suggest to me that people are following these guidelines, they are interested in these guidelines, and they haven't necessarily lost confidence in them. So that's another data point that I think is important to take into consideration. And I see this as a positive thing. Maybe I'm looking at this wrong, but I think the more public input that you have, the better the decision-making can be. And we're obviously going to take all this information into consideration, as we should. And there are a variety of input focuses on all of this, and hopefully we're going to come up with the best guidelines that continue to have the faith and confidence in the American public.
And I would just add, even as we implement the statute in preponderance, that as you appropriately indicate, there are different levels of evidence, and we do, and it's related to your colleagues' earlier comment about aren't there different populations that are affected in different ways? And the evidence that we look at, and whether that's on the issue of sodium and what that recommendation will be, and what we did last time, it does look at different places where there is more evidence or less evidence, and I think that's something that is important to do. And I think we do follow statute, but we hear your point.
Thank
and
you.
the scientific review actually, when we get our documents,
if I can just, I
reflects
got
that.
10 seconds. If I can have one further point, I just think it's just important that the citizens want science to justify ideology, that it's the other way around. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Jim's time, yes, expired. Mr. Davis for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Burwell. It was great to speak with you last week, and thanks for being here and talking about this very important subject. Secretary Vilsack, I know you're probably going to be surprised by this, but I'm not going to ask you about the school lunch today. It has been discussed already, so I'll skip over that. But I do have some concerns. My most serious concern today is what I see as a lack of evidence to show that the recommended dietary patterns proposed by the DGA have been based on any evidence on children. According to the citations in some previous advisory reports for recommendations, the recommended diet has been tested almost exclusively on middle-aged men and women, whose nutritional needs obviously are very different from young people and growing children. In particular, I'm concerned because young children need certain vitamins and minerals, obviously, in order to grow and develop. We're talking about where in previous reports, the expert report states dietary patterns do not meet sufficiency goals for potassium, vitamin D, vitamin E, choline, and that vitamin A sufficiency may be marginal. You know, these are essential basic nutrients for growth and health in children. And as a dad of freshmen in high school and a coach, these are things that concern me on a regular basis too. At the same time, the DGAC appeared to be deficient in their role in developing nutritional guidance to meet the basic nutritional sufficiency for children to grow and be healthy. They were expanding their review of what has been referred to as the dining out topic. Specifically, the fast food category was broadened to capture other types of dining out venues, including like quick serve, casual, formal restaurants, and grocery store takeout. I'm given today's busy lifestyle, and really, when you look at restaurants, they've offered a lot more healthy choices than what we saw just a decade ago. You know, with that, I'm kind of disappointed. I think others are disappointed that restaurants seem to be singled out, even though they're doing their best to offer healthier options to customers. And that concerns me. And I just find it difficult to understand that location in which we would eat without any other consideration automatically impacts the quality or nutritional value of the food served. And I certainly understand that some restaurants may serve better food than others, but that's the consumer that can make that final decision on that too. So Secretary Burwell, I mean, wouldn't you agree that the nutrient content of food is more important than where the food is purchased, and that rather than directing people away from dining out, maybe we should focus on helping to educate them on their nutritional choices?
So with regard to the issue of children and the amount of research and evidence that we have in that space, even as we are preparing to complete where we are now, the conversation, my team actually brought up the issue of children yesterday as we look to making sure we have appropriate evidence for a number of the things that you're talking about for the next set, because I think what you're appropriately reflecting is the research doesn't exist because it is on older, so we need to get started on that now. So with regard to the issue of do we need to understand this better, we don't have the facts yet, we don't have a science base, but if we start now, we will for the next. With regard to the question
Great.
of the dining
I appreciate
out,
that.
the dining out question. Right now, 30% of your calories for Americans are consumed outside the home. And with regard to how we think about making sure that
What percentage?
30%. So when that is happening, I think what we need to focus on with regard to this issue is making sure people have appropriate information. That's what I think we want to do, is make sure that people have appropriate information to make the choices. As you reflect, it's up to people to make their own choices in that context. And I think that's where we touch on that issue. And again, always separating the advisory committee's work with the work that we are doing.
And both. My time's expired.
Chairman's time expired. Dr. Benechek, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here today. I want to follow up on a few of the thoughts that Representative Hartzler had. You know, as a physician, I've been involved in peer-reviewed science in my training and in my career, and I'm a little bit concerned about some of the things you guys have said here. She brought up the fact that, you know, I think it was the Journal of the AMA brought out that 52% of Americans are pre-diabetic or diabetic. And yet, you know, the dietary recommendations that, as I understand it, are not really appropriate for that. I mean, there's too much carbohydrates. These people have a carbohydrate intolerance, and there's more carbohydrates in the diet that you're recommending than is really appropriate for that. And you mentioned that this would be a treatment, but this is really not a treatment. This is a preventative problem, and I think that, you know, you have to address that more. I guess those are just some of my comments, but one of the questions that I had is, how are the studies taken in, you know, how do you determine what studies to put into, to base your science on? I mean, I've got evidence that this evidence library included some trials while excluding several other larger trials, some of which were funded by the NIH. And I don't know why all the studies aren't included in the data. I mean, how does that not lead me to believe that there's a predetermined result that's been looked for?
Well, the process starts with a series of questions, that are formulated, and then information is accumulated, and it goes through a process of evaluation.
Is the NIH involved in this process?
Well, it's involved in the sense that the NIH helps to fund studies that...
I know, but I mean, they're not involved as interagency review of how the studies are picked?
So with regard, I think there is, well, three. One is the library of materials that people use, and that's housed at USDA. I think the second is...
So is stuff excluded from that library? Who makes the choice of what goes in the library?
Well, there's a process that the folks at the National...
I mean, that's what I'm asking. Is the NIH involved in that process? I mean, I'm just surprised that NIH-funded studies, some of which are larger than the studies that you rely on for your data, contradictory studies, funded by the NIH, are not included in the data. So I'm just kind of wondering why.
If you can give me specific studies...
Well, yeah, I can do that.
Yeah, I'll be able to provide you a specific answer as to why that particular study or series of studies were not included, or perhaps they were, and we're having a misunderstanding.
Well, my understanding is they're not. That's why I'm concerned, that because leading to me to, some of your comments suggested that with diabetes and prediabetes and obesity are major problems in this country, and because of the cut down on the fat portion of the diet, we're recommending more carbohydrates. Well, that's exactly the problem that diabetics have, is not being able to respond to carbohydrates. So, I mean, for the majority of the people, 52% of the people being pre-diabetic, this is the wrong diet to recommend. So when you say it's a general diet, well, that's great, but then shouldn't be the caveats that Ms. Hartler mentioned? I mean, this is pretty serious stuff here, because somebody else mentioned when we were kids, people aren't as fat. Back when we were kids, we were eating more fat. And frankly, it's not an exercise thing as far as I can see, because I'm experienced with that. If you eat a lot, you can't exercise it all off. You have to get it right.
Gentleman's time has expired.
I'm sorry, I could go on, but
Mr. Chairman, if I could just 30 seconds. I would say that the NEL website will provide you the information as to why certain studies weren't selected. But if you get us specific information, Doctor, we'll be happy to provide you specific answers to specific studies.
Mr. Allen for 4 minutes.
Yes, and I'll just follow up on that question. That as far as the NEL was concerned, as far as the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee did not use the NEL for more than 70% of their research questions. Why was the NEL not used in these guidelines?
For certain issues like food pattern analysis that they needed to do to understand what we actually are eating, an issue that has been brought up a number of times in this hearing, that is not information that would be available there, and they need to turn to other sources for that information to understand what is it actually Americans are eating. The sources for that are different. I think there are some other issues. The reason it's not all there is if that's not where the source of information can come from. There are certain data analytics, and there are also places where systemic reviews have already been done in the issues, and while they do their own systemic review, they at least consider the other systemic reviews, and so I don't think those are counted in that percentage, but Secretary, you probably, since it's housed it.
Well, the only other thing I would say is that the review process goes through a series of mechanisms to try to provide an understanding of what the best science is, the best available science is. And it's a series of things, the Cochrane Collaboration, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, the Aging for Healthcare Research and Quality, the data quality, all consistent with the Data Quality Act. And so that's the other parameter that we have to work under, is that the Congress has given us direction under the Data Quality Act as to how this is to be managed.
Well, the NEL is basically science-based. I mean, there's very little ideology there. I mean, they go by exact science, and I'm not quite sure why you'd
I still don't understand why you're not using them as more of a resource in these guidelines.
They are used extensively.
Extensively.
Okay.
It's only when a question can't be answered. One of the issues is certain of the data analytics around what everyone is eating right now are different sources, is my understanding of why the advisory committee turned to, didn't use it. That's the kind of.
So they didn't have the information on more than 70% of the research?
I think there are a number of other places that the advisory committee has to turn to other things, and they do that.
Regarding sodium, obviously, there's some of us that retain fluid, and there are others who do not retain fluid. Sodium, when I was back in my athletic career, I took salt pills, and I had a hard time retaining fluid. Of course, now it's the opposite. I'm on a low-sodium diet. All this stuff is very personal. It depends strictly on, your DNA and that sort of thing. In my opinion, it's very dangerous to set forth guidelines when, everybody's, has a at different ages, you have different requirements. And, of course, we already talked about it. It doesn't apply necessarily as much to children. And I think the mistrust here is that, this one-size-fits-all thing. Because, folks are getting a lot of bad, on our SNAP program. They're getting a lot of, they're really not getting good information, and then the consequences are this epidemic of diabetes that we have, particularly in Georgia, with folks who, do not know, how their diet works and how it fits. Is there any way to get this more locally based rather than Washington top down?
I think we want to get it to the place where it is useful, and I think that's a big part of the conversation. With regard to the issues like sodium, I think we do take care to not put something, a standard that it is the standard for everyone, not the standard for individuals. And then I think this is about how one implements in terms of if it is the standard, but if you have a certain disease condition, then we need to figure out how we, in a public health setting and other settings, can provide the right information for you. Because the IOM has said 2,300 milligrams of salt. But perhaps right state, that's not actually accurate.
I'm less than 1,000, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time
So
expired.
we have to make sure, even though we set at 23, that we can have a form in which we can communicate so you know where to turn together with your physician.
Mr. Molinaire for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Secretary Vilsack and Secretary Burwell. Thank you for being with us, and my apologies for my voice. It still hasn't gotten better since yesterday. I wanted to just a couple of themes that I've heard, especially you, Secretary Vilsack, stating today is that you don't want to assume what we'll do with the guidelines. That you don't want to predetermine what the outcome will be. And is that a fair assessment?
The process hasn't been completed yet.
Okay, and then one of the other themes I heard you say was that more public input you have, the better decisions we'll have. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, one of the concerns I have about the process that you're currently following, my understanding is you have the dietary guidelines that are based on the expert report from the advisory committee, and then that's translated by you and your staff into or your departments into actual guidelines.
That's one aspect of it, Congressman. It's not the only thing that we rely on or look at. It's one piece of a large puzzle.
Okay. Well, here's the concern is I know that we've had a comment period to date, and it seems that right now the process only allows for the American people to comment after the committee releases its report, but does not allow for public comment after USDA and HHS release the final dietary guidelines. And I appreciate you did extend the 60-day public comment period by additional 15 days following the release of the report this spring. But as you can tell from the hearing today, there's still considerable criticism of the report. And there is a provision in the fiscal year 2016 agricultural appropriations legislation that, if enacted, requires a 90-day comment period after the dietary guidelines are formally released. And this approach, this process seems more in line with the Administrative Procedures Act, which long predates the current process you're using for the dietary guidelines. And considering the fact that more than 29,000 comments were submitted on this report, while only 2,000 were received on the 2010 report, it really shows that there's a great deal of interest in this by the public. And it seems to me that the public should have a final opportunity to comment on this report before it's finalized. And I guess my question is, would you agree to give the American people another comment period, given the fact that the 2015 committee report generated the most comments in the history of the guidelines?
Well, I would, first of all, I'd point out that there were a number of places where the public had, before even the public comment period, as the Dietary Advisory Group was meeting, there were a series of public meetings, opportunities for people to have input and alike. There's also been continued opportunity to have input in the process. The challenge I have, Congressman, is when is the process? You have to have a finality to it. You have to have a stopping point to it. And in order for us to be able to factor into the various other decisions we have to make that are in some place based on the guidelines. So I'm concerned about how long you extend this process.
Well, yeah,
and I would say the public does have a way of commenting on this, and that is that you know, they could decide not to follow them. They could decide to be critical of them once they are proposed. So I mean, there is an ongoing debate and conversation about this.
I guess
it never ends.
My concern is, right from the start, you know, you made the comment, and I appreciated it, that you didn't want to prejudge what the guidelines will be. It's not a complete process. You're taking in feedback now. But the reality is once you publish those guidelines, those are the guidelines, and there is no avenue for the public to have input on that. And I think that's troubling.
Well, I would disagree with that in the sense that there's already been several places where they have had input, and they can continue to have input. They continue to respond to the 2010 guidelines, which are part of the foundation and the information that we take into consideration. So it's an ongoing education process. I don't think it ever stops. Now, there may not be a formalized period of time, but it never stops.
Well,
Gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
King, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for testifying today. And a few questions still come to mind after all this discussion that we've had here. And the first one that I have is that when I look at data on the students that are overweight or obese, do we have any evidence that they were which direction their weight has gone? I asked first Ms. Burwell. Do we have any indication on whether this program is reducing the overweightness of our children in school, or whether it might be working against us?
So with regard to the specifics of programs in schools, I would defer to my colleague, Secretary Vilsack, in terms of those programs. What I think we do know is that in starting to see overarching across the board, not just from a programmatic school base, but we are starting to see the numbers go in the right direction. With regard to the specifics of school programs, I would defer to the Secretary Vilsack.
And I was actually prepared to redirect that question after your response, so thanks for pointing that out. I'd say this information, Mr. Secretary, that according to the Center for Disease Control, we saw the obesity rate of high school students decrease by 9% in the 4 years prior to the Healthy and Hunger-Free Kids Act's implementation. And in the 4 years after that, the obesity rate increased by 16%. Have you seen any data like that from the Center for Disease Control, and does that cause you to wonder what the result of this might be?
Congressman, I'd be happy to take a look at that information to better understand it. But I think there's no question in my mind, this is not a situation where we're going to see fundamental change in a year. I think it's going to be a generational process. And I'm convinced that from a generational process, we're going to see progress. And I think Secretary Burwell's correct that we have begun to see progress, particularly among younger children.
Let me just ask you, this data says the opposite. It says the obesity rate of high school students had reduced by 9%. We just picked the 4 years since it's been implemented and went to the 4 years prior, so it was the longest period of time that we could have that would have balance. 4 years before, 4 years after. In the 4 years before, obesity rates went down 9% according to CDC, and 4 years after, obesity rates for high school students went up 16% according to the CDC. Now, I don't know how to explain that, because what I'm getting back from my constituents and across this country is more and more complaints about not enough food for these kids. And I would ask, Mr. Secretary, we're all very well aware of those complaints, especially as this was implemented in the fall of 2014. Now we're well into the school year of 2015. Are those complaints gone up or down in comparison to the year earlier?
They've gone down. In fact, some school districts that left the program have come back into the program.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And how's that program doing in Rhode Island that was spawned by the waste? And do you have any measure on the waste of the food that's been, the program in Rhode Island that I'm referring to, as aptly named, it's at North Smithfield, Rhode Island, where they're feeding 3,000 pigs with the waste from the street that's created. And I still get a lot of complaints on hungry kids. And so I'm concerned, is there that question, and then is there evidence that our students, K through 12, are getting overweight because of school lunch program, or are they eating that food somewhere else that's making them overweight? Was there ever any evidence that indicated it came from the school lunch?
Congressman, in terms of food waste, there's the Rudd study at the University of Connecticut, there's the Harvard Public Health School study, there's a study at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, suggesting that kids are eating more fruits and vegetables, no more food waste, and in fact are eating more of their entrees than before. So I don't think there's documentary evidence. There may be anecdotal evidence from school to school, and we are obviously focused on the food waste issue. I'm sorry, your second question?
Were they ever getting overweight on school lunch? Was there ever any evidence prior to 2010?
Well, you know, that's a sort of an interesting question. It could be answered yes and no. Yes, because it was part of the overall caloric intaking, and if they were taking more calories than they should, then everything that they ate in that particular day, in a sense, contributed. But if you're asking whether or not the number of calories consumed in a school meal, if we fit it within the standard, it shouldn't contribute to obesity.
Either before or after
especially if we are reducing fat, sodium, and sugar as we are.
I am out of time. I regret. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Newhouse for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, Madam Secretary, for being here with us this morning. Appreciate your time. I've got a couple observations, but also some requests and a question or two, and try to get through in 4 minutes. I've spoken with a lot of impacted constituents, and also through my own review, it seems clear that this Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee went outside the scope of their mandate in developing the recommendations for the report, including policy recommendations from taxes to local restaurant zoning to food labeling and sustainability policy. According to the underlying statute that was a sole product of this committee back in 1990, each such report shall contain nutritional and dietary information and guidelines for the general public. Secretary Vilsack, back in March, the Wall Street Journal reported you saying, and I quote, "I read the actual law, and what I read was that our job ultimately is to formulate dietary and nutrition guidelines, and I emphasize dietary and nutrition because that's what the law says. I think it's my responsibility to follow the law." Sustainable diets are an appropriate debate to have, you said. However, there are forums and places for that to take place, and I was pleased to hear your comments. But what concerns me is the lack of evidence to suggest that neither of the agencies exercised any effort to instruct the advisory committee on their scope or mandate. When you, Secretary Vilsack, and Secretary Burwell, your predecessor, established the committee, you did so under the Federal Advisory Committee Act. This act is designed to ensure that advice by the various advisory committees formed over the years is objective and accessible to the public. The act has formalized a process for establishing, operating, overseeing, and terminating these advisory bodies across government. The DGAC members are not full-time employees and rely very heavily on agency staff to carry out their duties. To be clear, when I review portions of the report, such as the advisory committee's conflicting statements on encouraging lower meat consumption, but then higher meat consumptions for the Mediterranean diet, or when I can see the advisory committee's recommendations on added sugars versus natural sugar, or use a lower scientific threshold than groups like the Institute of Medicine have used to reach their conclusions, I worry greatly about the process and the guidance and oversight that they've been given. I think it would be helpful for the committee for you to provide these committee evidence, in writing to confirm that your agencies did, in fact, make attempts to oversee the advisory committee once it became clear they were delving to areas of public policy. In response, I would like to see evidence that your agencies provided instructions to the committee during their assembly to ensure they were staying focused on the right guidance and not straying into policy matters outside their scope or mandate. And likewise, I'd like to receive documented evidence of the instructions agencies provided to the committee on the understand their report must be based on the preponderance of scientific and medical knowledge that's current at the time of publication. And finally, I would like to welcome your comments on any advice you could give future secretaries as to future advisory committees and how they could stay focused on their charter and produce a recommendation that really stays coloring within the line. So I'd appreciate response. Thank you.
We'll certainly provide response to your questions, Congressman, as we're bound to do, and would be happy to do that in writing. I think my advice to future secretaries will be to continue the process of educating people about what these recommendations are and what they are not, and the distinction between the report and the guidelines. There seems to, again, I've said this several times today, there seems to be a misunderstanding upon some of folks that the report equals the guidelines, and that is not the case. The report is one aspect of our consideration, one aspect of the data or the information that is used to formulate these guidelines. And to me, this debate has been helpful in getting a better understanding of precisely what the recommendations are. And I think that the discussion we've had today is also healthy as it relates to what is the purpose of these guidelines. Is it focused on prevention, or is it focused on treatment, or should it be focused on both? I think that's a healthy discussion.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Thompson, 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, both secretaries. Really appreciate you be here. My first question actually is very specific. It's an area I care a lot about. So my question is, why do Americans, especially children, fall short of the dietary guidelines recommended servings of milk and its 9 essential nutrients and vitamins? And what can we do to remove policies that are hindering milk consumption or promote policies that could enhance milk consumption?
We can, basically we're taking a look at those issues right now, Congressman, and I think that's the goal here is that as we learn more, as we understand more, as we relearn lessons of long ago, that's obviously going to change the direction and focus. That's the whole purpose and the whole reason why we do this every 5 years is it's an evolving process. Yeah. And as our information evolves, our policies will evolve. And we are taking a look at the issue of milk and taking a look at ways in which milk can be introduced into diets in a variety of different ways, dairy products.
And we work together on that, and I appreciate those efforts. I want to know, how much of a factor do you think that it is that we publish these guidelines once every 5 years? And as you said, 5 minutes before you're ready to publish it, there's new evidence that probably is contrary to what you're publishing. And I'm assuming, correct me if I'm wrong, that the rate of research within nutrition is significant, which is a really good thing. But so the fact is, as soon as you publish these guidelines, they're inaccurate, and the longer they're there until the next 5 years, the more inaccurate they are. But when you publish them, doesn't that influence the markets? I mean, I would argue, I would think, I'm not going to argue, but I would think that when it comes to milk, the fact that at one point the guidelines discouraged milk, took all the flavor out of it because somehow fat was bad for you, and I know the science today shows contrary to that. But you take the fat, you take the taste out, and that somehow these guidelines that we do every 5 years that are never really totally accurate and increasingly more accurate towards the end of the 5 years impacts the ag commodity markets. So my question for you, given the fact that these were, I think, under, I may be wrong, President Carter, so it'd be the late 70s when it was originated. Are Americans healthier or less healthy since the guidelines have been published? And therefore, haven't these guidelines somewhat failed? I mean, we're talking about increasing obesity. The Pentagon is more concerned than ever about having access to, having kids that would be able to serve in the military. Have these guidelines really been successful given disease, chronic illnesses and conditions? And that's not to me a criticism, because my second question is, then how do we use these in a way that they could be successful, because they don't seem like they're accomplishing the objective, as you two have very well articulated today.
So I think we do want to, and I think the issue of obesity is one that has a number of different elements, and the physical activity guidelines, which are something that Congress mandated that
As
we
a
do.
former rehabilitation guy, I'm all in on that.
So that's
agree.
another
Yeah.
piece that I think that we need to focus on, and we need to make sure that these things are being used. I think you're right to reflect. I think the question is, what is the critical path issue and what is the counterfactual? That's the other thing that I think we all can't answer. We're on the wrong trajectory, but would the trajectory have been worse? And then second,
Sure. Well,
what is the barrier?
Let me make a suggestion and get a response in a few seconds I have left. It seems like once every 5 years, this doesn't work because it changes. And in fact, it can negatively impact ag commodities which is irresponsible to tell people not to eat certain things when the next round of research says that. Shouldn't we do something in this day and age with technology that we just share the best research with folks, a place where people can go to get the best possible information on terms of eating, and knowing that that changes all the time? Once every 5 years, I don't think this is effective. Sorry, Chairman.
Honestly, this discussion suggests that there is some extraordinarily bright line on science, that there is something over here, there is the real science, and then over here, there's not the real science. The science is evolving.
That is my point.
And so...
And that's what science does.
It does. So you have to have general guidelines that provide some parameters.
But do we have static guidelines once every 5 years, or do we have mechanisms?
You could theoretically go through this process every year, but I don't know that that would be particularly helpful. No. I think the 5-year period is good. Obviously, it gets better informed. And I think this issue of obesity is far more complex than just simply saying, because we have these guidelines, that somehow we've become an obese nation. I think it's got to do with the fact that an average kid spends in front of a screen every day. I mean, that's part of it, right? It is portion size. That's part of it. It is a variety of factors. So the guidelines, I suppose if every American followed the guidelines, you know, it might be a different situation, but we don't.
Gentleman's time has expired.
But it doesn't mean we shouldn't have them.
Yeah. Mr. Lamalfa for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and both secretaries, thank you for being here today. Ms. Burwell, let me follow up on what Mr. Thompson was saying on that as well. With, you know, ever since I was a kid, you know, eggs are bad, so my grandparents had a lot of powdered eggs because of their age and factors like that, and it turns out eggs are okay later. Then you hear, you know, beef, red meat, and then you got high-protein diets are supposed to help you lose weight. Somebody was talking to just over the weekend, a constituent, they're, you know, lost weight, but they're staying away from fruit. Well, because fruit has carbs, sugar in it. And well, I mean, how are people supposed to really know when the ideals are changing all the time, the guidelines? So I guess following up on the 5-year thought, is it good to have a hard and fast 5-year line of changing the dietary guidelines, or should it be less frequent, more frequent, or does it need to be even more kind of change what you know to change and have and leave the rest alone? What do you think of that, please?
I think that the Congress, in making a choice on 5 years, probably made a good choice. And the reason for that is while we've heard from some of your colleagues about extending the period, you know, let's think that this took 18 months for the advisory committee to do its work. Then you had an additional 75 days of the period of comment for us to receive comments on that. And then you have the period for us to review and get out. And so when you add that up and you think about that timetable, you know, if you tried to shrink that, the question is would you have relevant change?
Well, I guess what I'm looking at is that maybe you have most of the guidelines are going to be consistent for a long time. When you have school books, for example, it seems like you got to change. They throw out the whole school book. You're buying a new one, where maybe most of that math lesson is fine. So maybe you're just changing the elements in there since it's electronic, and not doing something every 5 years. So let me follow it up with. Should there be a legislative change that we should produce that would help this process?
We are like the school books. We are like, most of this is consistent. I think you reflected in terms of where there are changes. The things that there are key recommendations on have been relatively consistent over the period since the 1980s in terms of the importance of fruits and vegetables, the importance of a balanced approach that provides nutrition that is fewer calories than the nation currently consumes. In several select areas, I think it is fair to appropriately reflect the science has changed, but the dominant picture is a very similar picture over the periods of time. And so I also think it's important to distinguish between the dietary guidelines and what is happening in our popular culture with regard to different diets that are proposed by different people in different ways. And so I think distinguishing that is also an important element, and this gets to what are the guidelines and what are they not.
Certainly, a lot of overlap, a lot of different messages being sent. The dietary guidelines, though, do you think they can be seen by people as confusing or difficult to follow? Do you think the 2015 guideline will be more straightforward, people a little more straightforward ideas of how to follow this pattern for what they need? Is the 2015 going to be improvement over that?
I think we will obviously work to make things as simple as we can, but I think the real way that people interact with these things is actually in their implementation in programs, and whether that's the topic we've talked about in school lunch or another topic we haven't touched as much on, which is the labeling issues. And that's how most people interact with what the dietary guidelines are in terms of how they get their advice about what they're going to eat and that sort of thing.
Well, let me ask then, since most of the efforts say to guidelines, what does follow the DGA mean to you, Madam Secretary?
What it means to me is that there are these guidelines, and when we apply those from a perspective of the federal government to certain of our programs, that they are the basis that we think about promoting the programs, and whether that's our Meals on Wheels program, or as we think about our Million Hearts initiative at CDC to try and reduce by 1 million the number of people with heart attacks, that an important element of that is understanding what the dietary guidelines say.
Thank you. You've had a very difficult job the last year or so thanks for coming.
Gentleman's time's expired. And before we adjourn, I've asked David Scott, any comments you've got for the ranking member?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First thing I want to say is how much we appreciate both of you cabinet officials coming before us at the same time. That's a rarity, and we really appreciate it. Agriculture is indeed our most important industry. It's the food we eat, it's the water we drink, it's our survival. And I think you got the feeling from this committee of how important this is. And I hope that what we have discussed today, that you all will take back in the manner and the spirit in which we have given it, because this is the single most important industry in the world, our agriculture. My hope is that you will take back and understand, even go back and review a bit. Secretary Vilsack, you hit the nail on the head when you stated that they stare before the screen. That's exactly right. When you and I were coming along, folks would say, "Daddy or Mama, can I go out to the playground?" That's a phrase we don't even hear now. They go up, I'm going upstairs, or I'm going downstairs, I'm going in the room, and get on the internet, sit before that screen hour after hour. And that's why it's so important now that we use our science to make up for that. And that's why I hope that you will take my suggestions to look and make sure we're using the strong scientific evidence. And if there's things like the low-calorie sweeteners, where the study has already shown that it will lower obesity, go back and review and explain why you don't use that. Or maybe you go back and you look at it and you say, you know what? I think we can use this and make a difference. And that's why I think, Mr. Chairman, this has been an extraordinary and very important hearing, and I thank you for calling it.
Well, I thank the gentleman. I also want to thank our witnesses. This is a big deal to get both of you at the table at the same time. I appreciate that. Hopefully, the emphasis was on the process and restoring trust if there needs to be restored trust. Hopefully, the next time that the key is the questions that are asked for the committee to answer. And Ms. Burwell, your testimony said that guidelines don't change much from issue to issue. Is that a bias that if I'm a scientist and I've got a body of work that is conclusions and I'm going to be hard bent to change my conclusion against new evidence, that's going to be an issue that's there. Hopefully the next time the question will be asked, are the guidelines themselves contributing to the problem? The emphasis on carbohydrates over the last 20 years and the impact it's had on these issues that we're talking about with obesity or diabetes, other things. Do we have anybody who's going to live these guidelines for 5 years so we can see what it did to them as approach to it? And I know you guys try to gather that information, but the guidelines are important. They're voluntary for me. I'm going to go ahead a little bit, and I will decide for myself. They're not voluntary, though, and they get woven into school lunch programs and SNAP and everything else, so they become the law of the land in many instances. So it's important that we get these right, and I appreciate both of your comments this morning about limiting the criticisms about the sustainability and taxes. You laid those to rest. Thank you so very much for that. The emphasis on staying within the scope that was supposed to be there. I appreciate that, and I really also appreciate your work on trying to clarify that these are guidelines and that the report was one thing. You've got work to be done between now and December to make that happen. The idea that perhaps a proposed rule might have some value, I understand, Tom, that getting it finished is an important process as well. So I appreciate the spirit with which both of you came today and the comments that were made from my colleagues. Under the rules of the committee, the record of today's hearing will remain open for 10 calendar days to receive additional material and supplementary written responses from the witnesses to any questions posed by a member. This hearing of the Committee on Agriculture is adjourned.